Welcome, everyone, to Augmenting Native AWS Security Controls, brought to you by Rapid7. I'm Christopher Hertz. I'm the Vice President of Cloud Security Sales for Rapid7, and I'm joined by my colleague, Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Korstorffen, Cloud Solutions Architect for Rapid7.
Alex, thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to talk about cloud security within AWS. The first thing I wanted to mention is that within AWS, organizations are responsible for their own security in the cloud. And that's really important because as we think about the shared responsibility model that we'll talk about shortly, 90% of all organizations that do not control public cloud use will inappropriately share sensitive data by 2025, according to Gartner. And that's sort of a shocking statistic. Another one is through 2024, the majority of enterprises will continue to struggle with appropriately measuring cloud security risks. And last, but certainly not least, through 2025, customers will be responsible for 99% of the cloud security issues. Alex, in your experience, as you've worked with various companies over the last few years around cloud adoption and doing so securely, have you seen sort of similar challenges relative to shared responsibility and customers understanding their need to really focus on how they're operating the cloud?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating stat, and it's massive. It's also not shocking. I think what I see is changing is that people are understanding more that they've got these challenges that they need to get ahead of, but the actual resolution of the problem is still something that they're working on figuring out. So, yeah, it's not the numbers we want to see, but I think it makes sense.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the AWS shared responsibility model because I've mentioned it and I brought it up here on the screen. This is really important that for most of the folks we talk to, they understand inherently that cloud is secure, and they read about breaches maybe in the news, and they think, gosh, should I be worried about cloud? And the answer is the cloud security itself, the underlying cloud, is actually incredibly secure. There's never been a breach. Where the challenge begins, and this is what Gartner was talking about, is that you are responsible for the operation of the cloud. And that's often around things like configuration. And so therefore, Amazon has been very clear about this by publishing what they call the shared responsibility model that really tries to break down the difference between what they are essentially securing and what anyone consuming Amazon Web Services needs to think about how they operate the cloud securely. How do you describe this to folks when you talk about the shared responsibility model, Alex?
Yeah, I think kind of coming back to like the data center days is the best ways. The actual physical security of these environments is taken care of, and the actual hardware and who has access, to all these different servers and services. But once you've been given this platform then to work with, it is your responsibility to make sure that we're kind of turning all the right knobs and dials to ensure that how we're configuring this on that software side, make sure that it keeps us secure and configured the way that we would hope and need to see.
Absolutely. Well, and to that point, one of the challenges is that with the shared responsibility model, that cyber incidents are actually costly and increasing. So on the screen we talk a little bit about some of the study that we've done. So we do a cloud security study at Rapid7 every year, and we publish the results. And what we saw is essentially a 42% increase from 2018 to 2019 in major breaches. And what we also identified was that about an estimated $5 trillion in damages across 2018 and 2019 relative to breaches around cloud. And that often falls around things like cloud misconfigurations, and we'll talk a little bit about how do you guard against this. But the point of this is really, this is not an abstract problem, right? Keeping the ability to operate the cloud securely is incredibly important. Not just because it's something that we want to do and it's something that's good right for our customers, but there's real economic impacts on companies that are not sufficiently thinking about this and putting in place a strategy. And so to that, Alex, I want to talk a little bit about one of our favorite subjects, which is frameworks, because one of the things we find in our studies is that understanding of frameworks is actually quite low. That when we go in and talk with various IT professionals through our survey, and we've surveyed more than 2,000 across the globe in 2019, what we find is that 42% do not know the frameworks their company uses to maintain compliance and standards and regulations, which is shocking. And then the second one is that for almost half of the respondents whose organizations use public cloud, they said that developers and engineers at times ignore or circumvent these. And so I wanted to dig in a little bit there, Alex, with you and talk about what's the, first of all, why do you think frameworks aren't that well known? And secondly, why do you think people might, circumvent them?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of a middle challenge in there that really ties the two together a lot of times is, even for the companies that do know what frameworks they should be adhering to at a very high level, they know, okay, I want to have the certification, but actually translating that into very tangible things that they should be doing is really hard. And there's, not a lot of content out there that's really been put out for it. And so if someone just comes to you and says, I want to be NIST compliant or PCI compliant, okay, that's nice, but what does that actually mean? And so I think, in addition to just not understanding what frameworks maybe they should be adhering to, actually then translating that to specifically what that means for cloud infrastructure configurations is a whole nother challenge.
Yeah.
I think
And
back
I'll
then
add into that. I think
sorry,
one of the things that we think about is that Amazon Web Services democratizes access to IT, right? You now have developers and engineers who have, for the first time, really direct self-service access to core critical infrastructure, and that's now part of their job description. And what I often hear from talking with various companies is that means you have to democratize security, and you in cloud security specifically. And the way you do that in part is through frameworks, right? Because someone has to know what good looks like. And for many of the folks who are the first time having to participate in security in a more meaningful way, this is a really key element. And part of that means, I think, changing the way that security thinks about communicating this stuff back to the people who are now really responsible and participant developers. In the past, it was fine to be command and control and say, well, I know all this stuff and I'm going to hold it myself. But now, not only do I have to know what the frameworks are, I have to operationalize them against cloud, but I also have to make sure I'm communicating that back to this broad organization that maybe in the past I didn't have to build. And so, cloud security is more than just tech. It's also sort of cultural changes, communication changes, moving away from command and control to maybe trust but verify. Does that ring true to you? Yeah. So let's talk. So one of the frameworks that people, and by the way, we have this conversation a lot, and people come back to say, hey, what framework should I use? And when you go and look at what Microsoft, what Amazon puts forward, and what other cloud service providers put forward, it's often the NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST CSF, and so we did want to talk about that because that's one of our favorite frameworks. And so I think the important thing is to talk through a little bit about what is NIST CSF and how does it sort of organize. And with NIST CSF, it is a framework that can be applied to cloud security. It really has a couple different core components: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And each of those areas sort of encapsulates a broader segment. Do you want to sort of riff for a moment, Alex, on why NIST CSF has been sort of a popular choice for Amazon Web Services, but also for many of our customers, and why we recommend it as a good starting point?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons. I think first off, NIST kind of pre-CSF was frequently an industry standard for people who not only worked in government sectors but also just in general wanted a great security framework for people who might not have as specific kind of industry requirements as your HIPAAs and PCIs and the like. And then for CSF in particular, I think they've taken the great parts of NIST, kind of updated some of them a bit, but also done it in a way where they've provided more, maybe easier to kind of map to guidelines, but also doing it in a way where it's not so strict, where they're almost too specific, where if they don't mention it, then therefore you don't have to do it. I think they hit a nice balance.
Yeah. Well, let's dig in, because one of the nice things about Amazon, and they've really been focused on providing foundational and layered security services, is that you can map these services back against NIST CSF. So one of the things that we've talked about is the customer is responsible for the operation of the cloud. It's incredibly important to do this because the risks are real, right? We saw that cyber attacks that try and exploit misconfigurations and policy violations are rising. The cost of those is enormous to companies. that we have to go through a cultural shift to start adopting frameworks and applying those. And then the next step is, well, okay, but how do we do all that within this? And the answer is you want to use the native cloud security services. And so what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is how do you marry back the cloud security services that Amazon offers you natively back into something like the NIST CSF framework so that you're always going to be able to leverage those. And it might be worth walking through each of these, but we'll start with identify. And I don't know, Alex, if you want to sort of pick one native cloud security service, but we only have 30 minutes today. We could probably spend 4 hours talking through each and every single one of these services. But I think it's important to sort of cherry pick a couple and highlight along each way and sort of talk about how do we apply that to native cloud security. And then the next thing we'll do after this is really talk about when does it make sense to start augmenting those native cloud security services to try and sort of to automate and drive more sustainability and resilience. But maybe let's walk through identify first, pick one and then go to protect and then to detect and then respond and then recover, Alex, if that sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, I think at the highest level when you're talking compliance within AWS, config is the one that comes up most often because that's where you do some sort of definition of what sort of checks do I want to run, and then you get an output from there that we can then take and kind of pass down the line. And I think really coming from there, protect is probably the most massive service in that there's so many different angles of how this can be set up. For something like VPC, well, VPC is going to help us just kind of day-to-day operationally with making sure our network is all set up properly. But in addition, making sure that our VPC is set up in a nice and secure way is a fundamental piece of making sure that our environment stays tight and protected.
And I would add in there on the protect side, the area that I really think about is identity access management, because IAM sort of falls in this category, and a lot of people think about IAM a lot, but to me, IAM is probably one of the most important elements that, while it's getting a lot of thought, people maybe underestimate the complexity associated with it and the importance of building out an IAM governance model and strategy that is really resilient and scalable. If you think about IAM, in my opinion, it is the new perimeter, right? You go from the traditional data center model where you have a hardened perimeter, a firewall that may surround your entire data center, and you go from there to Amazon Web Services, where it's more about component boundaries, where firewalls do exist, but especially as you drive towards things like zero trust, you want to drive towards least privilege access. And when you look at a lot of the exploits that occur around misconfigurations, they often have at least part of the attack chain is around insufficient IAM governance. In other words, something is overly permissive or improperly permissed, and as a result, it's been exploited and leveraged. And so, when you think about identity access management governance, a lot of people say, "Oh, what's different?" And maybe it might be worthwhile diving in briefly and talk about, just sort of the complexity there when we think about, even within a single account, sort of the 5 layers of access that people often have to, think about, whether that's service control policies or resource-based policy or session policy, and then on top of that, wildcards and conditionals. Do you want to maybe spend a couple minutes talking about the need for a strong IAM governance in the protect world, Alex?
Yeah, it's a great point in that, okay, I set up my network right, I set up my different services, but at the end of the day, IAM is that umbrella that sits over the top of everything. And so if I configure the rest of my environment perfectly, but that very top layer still has misconfigurations in it, then everything below is kind of for naught, because all those great changes that we've made can be unraveled. And so it's very important, but to your point, it's also very complex. And the reasons for that is that there's a number of different layers of where control can be exerted on these different permissions. And the upside with that is that gives us the opportunity to have a perfectly configured environment. But in reality, it can end up kind of taking us the other way, where there's so much complexity, it increases the opportunities for us to get things wrong. You're talking about the 5 layers, coming from explicit denies and then moving down to service control policies at the account level. We're seeing more and more services pop up with resource-based policies themselves. And we've got the user role permissions, we've got permission boundaries, all of these different pieces together essentially make kind of a Venn diagram of where permission actually lies. And unless you can kind of get that full picture of how everything comes together, it's really hard to make sure you're getting it right.
Well, and I think the other thing is as more individuals and companies start moving towards things like containers as a service and functions as a service slash serverless, identity becomes the main mechanism for security, right? And so again, if you were trying to think of a way to future-proof your protection, a solid, strong focus on IAM governance is the foundational element to that. But I don't want to spend all of our time on protect. Let's move on to detect as well. And here I think there's sort of two cool ones that I always like to talk about: AWS GuardDuty and then Macy. And I know we've got a whole slide on Macy, so maybe just let's touch on GuardDuty. And we always think this is an incredibly impressive technology. If folks aren't familiar with GuardDuty, certainly worth taking a look at. It really is about threat detection. Being able to look at using machine learning and AI across sort of all the data that Amazon has access to and is learning from to detect anomalies and other sort of areas. What are some of the things that you've seen GuardDuty as a useful mechanism to protect against?
Yeah, I think there's a couple highlights. I think the two most interesting angles from GuardDuty are on the compute side and the user side. On the compute side, I think one of the most compelling pieces about it is that they're not only pulling in information from like VPC flow logs to look for threats and anomalies on that side, but they've got a data feed that we don't have, and being able to correlate that with DNS logs. And so if I want to be able to flip a switch and say, hey, let me know which of my instances are mining Bitcoin, it's a great kind of turnkey service to get that very critical information very quickly. On the user side, being able to really get alerts on, again, when anomalies pop up. Maybe someone logged in in one country today and then in another continent tomorrow. Being able to get that sort of visibility on, again, where maybe some IAM compromise might have happened is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move into respond, where we talk a lot about sort of automation and investigation as sort of the two areas. Here we have things like CloudWatch and Lambda on the automate side, and on the investigate side we have things like again CloudWatch because it's on both sides, but also stuff like Amazon Detective and things like in CloudTrail. Do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of things like CloudTrail and CloudWatch and certainly we leverage them at Rapid7 to power our DivvyCloud product intensively. So I don't know if you want to talk a little about CloudWatch and CloudTrail and their importance in this world of automation and investigation.
Yeah, CloudTrail is probably the most important service, period. Because at the end of the day, if anything goes wrong or I need to understand what has happening or is happening, CloudTrail is going to give us that audit log of who did what and where. And so anytime we need to get some of that extra context, that's the first place that you want to go to start to piece together these different events that might have transpired that might not have been exactly what we were looking for. And then I think the follow-up is then using CloudTrail events plus like a CloudWatch event then feeds nicely into something like Lambda for then doing some more of that automation and remediation when problems pop up for those things that we said we just do not want to see in our environments.
Yeah. Well, and we often see the first thing that a malicious attacker who gets access may do is turn CloudTrail off, right? And we can talk about a little later about how you can augment cloud native security controls by automating the detection of things like that, where if someone tries to turn CloudTrail off or if it hasn't been turned on, that we automate that function so that we always have that good audit trail. Let's talk a little bit about Recover lastly, and then we'll move on next to talk a little bit more about one of my favorite services, Macy, because I think it's pretty cool, and if people aren't using it, they should take a look at it. It got a refresh recently. So we've got things like CloudFormation and Recover. Do you want to talk a little bit on the Recover side here, Alex? Like maybe just do a quick call out and the importance of some of the tech here and how you can leverage it.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, leaning on repeatability is really, really an important kind of foundation of what you should be doing. Because if your whole environment is, a bunch of one-off configurations that someone did and didn't document, if there's a problem and that configuration goes away, what do we do? But if we can start to lean on like infrastructure as code technologies such as CloudFormation, my whole environment can go away. And while that's not good, I can at least put it back together very quickly by just reloading in those same templates that created that environment in the first place. And then,
Yeah.
Beyond the config side, being able to back that up with something like Glacier for the data side of things, which is a little bit harder to templatize. I think those two things together really make a robust and, again, repeatable environment that can keep us secure.
That's great. Well, let's shift down and let's talk about Amazon Macy, which I've had a love affair with for many years. This is really about sensitive data. We just went back and talked about where the biggest risk is for companies. Yes, if my environment is exploited and there's Bitcoin mining occurring, that certainly costs me money, but it doesn't necessarily create brand reputation damage or legal or regulatory or commercial damage relative to loss of data that might be intellectual property or customer data. Right? That's data is often at the root of where economic damage occurs. And so fundamentally, one of the most important things is how do I know where my sensitive data resides? And I'll just sort of paint a picture, which is that I was just talking to a company where they have hundreds of Amazon S3 buckets that are open to the public on purpose, right? They are repositories that people log into. One of the challenges they face, of course, is that how do you detect then when one of those might be leaking sensitive data? Because you can't just say, oh, don't allow any open buckets to the world. Well, no, I need to do that. I need to have hundreds of buckets open, and they serve a legitimate purpose. Public-facing websites, data repositories, code repositories, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where Macy really comes in. And if you haven't looked at it recently, there was a update to the Macy service earlier this year, both in terms of sort of feature functionality, but also cost. And so if you looked at it before and said, this seems not for me for whatever reason, I would encourage you looking at it again. But maybe, Alex, do you want to dive in briefly with just a quick description of why Macy is so cool and how folks should be thinking about it?
Yeah, especially with the refresh. It's everything that I've heard from its users as well is that it's been extremely well received. And I think that the challenge is that the reason that people are going to want this and get value out of it is best case scenario, I go and I've got a perfectly configured bucket or buckets, and they are called, my sensitive buckets or something. And that's where all of my sensitive data should go. And if that's the case, and it's a known quantity of where I need to go and lock down these permissions, then it's at least a little bit more manageable. But if we're relying on people just getting it right and all sensitive data only going into those buckets, there might not be a problem. But the second someone gets it wrong and data starts going outside of those boundaries that I might have set up, how do I know about this? And so, not even just is the bucket actually public, but just is it encrypted and is it as locked down as it needs to be is a massive challenge at most scale, most different scales for people's environments. So in a perfect world, if we knew already exactly where we put every single one of our files across a whole company, we might not need Macy. But until that point, making sure that we can understand where this data resides and that we're then applying the appropriate controls on that is a pretty important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk next about, so we've just talked quite a bit about the native controls. And the first part is, if you go back to what we talked about before, again, operational responsibility on the side of the customer, important and critical that we do this because the risk is real. Increasing number of people who have to be participant in this process. And frameworks are important because of that, because we can communicate what a good looks like to this much, much broader audience, right? It's no longer 5 security professionals who know about this. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of developers who often have to be a participant in security. And now we have to leverage all these native controls that can help us ensure that we can apply the best things like NIST CSF against this. Part of that is also, though, that we have to go to a trust but verify model, right? Again, it's how do we get people to be participant in this democratized security world? And so a lot of it is people saying, well, look, I love all those controls you just talked about. How do I make sure those are being operated at scale sustainably? Um, and that especially grows with complexity as you think about the more individuals who are participant in this, right? The more developers, more engineers, maybe especially as a ratio to my security engineers, right? Scale is all relative. You may have a 10,000 person organization that has 100 security engineers. You may have a 50 person organization that has a part-time security engineer or none. And so scale is quite relative, but the idea is at what point does scale start to outstrip the sort of manual ability to manage and monitor this? And that often happens around the more people involved, the more cloud services involved, the more accounts that are involved, or in some cases, additional cloud service providers that may be involved. And what we find is that everyone has a risk profile, and that risk profile is very different for each person, or risk appetite. And that in the beginning, folks need to, if you're not using all the cloud native security controls today, the tools that Amazon offers, start looking back at that guide we just gave you around how to think about protect, detect, etc., and start lining that up and deploying those. But at some point, that will bring you down below your risk appetite level. But at some point, as complexity creeps up, leveraging all those really starts to fall down because it is a manual process in many cases. It is one where it can be useful to start to augment that. And that's really where we get into leveraging third parties like DivvyCloud by Rapid7, where we really can come in and help to automate and scale. So, for example, if CloudTrail is disabled or isn't turned on in the first place, having DivvyCloud can automatically detect that across all cloud environments, across all accounts, and ensure a single set of policies. Right? It's essentially taking the NIST CSF framework and operationalizing it and automating it and allowing security professionals to get visibility into where their frameworks are being applied, to be able to assess that risk, to prioritize that risk, and then to automate the remediation of that, whether that's driving workflows or whether that's essentially doing third-party orchestration or frankly reconfiguring cloud services on the fly, or all those things in a single workflow. And the beauty of that is really that you can drive automation. And so we have just a couple minutes left here, Alex, but I thought maybe spend just a few, just a minute or two talking about sort of automated remediation and the idea of how really that starts to drive a lot of this augmentation of the native cloud security tools.
Yeah. At the end of the day, everything gets harder at scale. And there becomes an inflection point where just throwing more man hours at the problem is not the answer anymore. And so at that point in time is when you want to start doing automation. And the thing with it, though, is that automation can be very helpful or very destructive. I think a lot of times when people think about remediation from day one, they immediately think of quarantining storage and killing off instances that aren't tagged properly and very aggressive and impactful remediations. And while those are definitely options and things that can bring a lot of value, it's almost never where you should start, because we want to make sure that we can kind of go for a crawl, walk, run sort of approach to bring an automation in a more thoughtful way that can make sure that we're bringing the organization along with us. And so we've got these levels here where, for starters, what about automation just for account configurations? Again, Crystal's already talking about like turning on CloudTrail, turning on flow logs, enabling IAM password policies. This is still automation that not only improves security, but also helps just save time. And then from there, as time goes on, we can use this to do more and more impactful changes. And where each organization stops as far as how much they're willing to automate is completely up to them. But I would argue that every organization would get value from at least some automation within their environment to, again, improve security and save time in the process.
Perfect. Well, just to wrap up, I want to talk again, we're with Rapid7. We have DivvyCloud by Rapid7. We protect cloud and container environments from misconfigurations, policy violations, risks, and identity access management challenges to provide you really continuous security and compliance in Amazon Web Services and other. As the broader Rapid7, we have a full portfolio that can help you secure really everything under the sun. And you can get a free trial with DivvyCloud by Rapid7 at divvycloud.com/free trial. And so thank you very much for joining Alex and me. We've really enjoyed this 30 minutes with you.